me try to set the scene before my two very bright colleagues go into the details. What to watch for on Turkish domestic politics that will be relevant in figuring out the future course of US-Turkish relations. The first important trend is further consolidation of one-man rule in Turkey. As of 2 days ago, Erdogan is now an executive president. He can issue decrees by himself, so he can pretty much legislate on any matter of interest to him. Within the first 48 hours, he has abolished the National Security Council. He has taken control of the opera and the theater. So from A to Z, he is using his newfound powers, and the trend will continue. Second, I referred to this as one-man rule. The second trend is this is becoming a dynasty. He has just appointed his son-in-law as the economy czar. So he combined a couple of, the economy ministry, treasury. So his son-in-law is now in charge of all of Turkey's economy, and the markets are responding horribly. For the last 48 hours, the Turkish lira is in free fall. Turkish shares, stock market is in free fall, and I think the trend will continue and will have major repercussions concerning Turkey's domestic and foreign policy. Third important trend to follow is further criminalization of the Turkish opposition. Already, the former leader of the HDP, the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party that Giran represents here in DC, is in jail, and he can give you further detail. But so are a number of lawmakers, mayors, city councillors, party officials, as well as other political activists. So we will see further criminalization and imprisonment as democratic space for the opposition is restricted. The fourth trend, which I find particularly worrying, is what I call a paramilitarization of politics in the making. We are familiar with, street gangs, militia, armed groups from Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, and for the most part, Turkey was an exception, right? Turkey, a Muslim majority member of NATO, an EU accession country, known for its relatively strong institutions, was a good example of the textbook definition of, Weberian definition of, state having a monopoly over the use of lethal force. This doesn't seem to be the case anymore. On the night of the elections, there were people with AK-47s celebrating all around Turkey, shooting, in public squares. Mafia leaders from prison releasing death lists of dissident journalists they want to eliminate. This is a trend in the making, but one we should be watching. Paramilitarization becomes a new norm. And the fifth trend to watch, as I said, is the economy. The economy is very important. As you might have followed, the reason for the snap election was Erdogan and his far-right ally, Devlet Bahçeli's fear of an imminent economic collapse. So they wanted to have the elections as soon as possible so that they can consolidate power and get another 5-year mandate. So now that the elections are over, the key question is what will be the future of the Turkish economy? For those of you who are not familiar, the key issue is, it can be summarized as over-leveraging. Turkish corporations have outstanding foreign currency debt. Their revenue stream is mostly in Turkish liras, and with the currency devaluation, the current revenue stream in lira is not enough to pay the euro and dollar and yen and Swiss franc outstanding loans. And so the imminent economic crisis will be a new type of a crisis. It's not about public finances. It's about corporate over-leveraging, and we will see what kind of an impact this will not only have on the Turkish economy, but on all the Western banks that have these outstanding loans to Turkey. So this is not about the Turkish economy only. There are dozens of Western banks who have billions and some tens of billions of exposure to the Turkish markets. Very quickly moving on to the foreign policy aspect, what to watch for. In Turkey-US, Turkey-EU, Turkey-NATO relations, currently the elephant in the room is the S-400 deal, which could trigger US sanctions. The Russians have promised to deliver them within the next year. So let's say there's at least another year to maybe change the crash course. One of the rumors is maybe Turkey could pass the S-400 to a third country instead of locating it within Turkey. My gut feeling, many in Washington have refused to believe that Erdogan, leader of a NATO country, could go for the S-400 system. From day one, I said it is possible, and we should take this threat to NATO seriously, because as U.S. ambassador to the NATO over the weekend said, for Turkey, Russia is trying to flip a NATO member. So this is a serious issue. There is growing Russian influence over Turkish politics, markets, society. In the opinion polls, Turks increasingly see Russia as a potential ally, and I think US's approval rate is down to 5%. So here is a bizarre mismatch. A NATO country that has had 200 years of a bloody history with Russia, who has suffered at the hands of Russian expansionism, is now going through a phase in which it thinks that NATO is an enemy and Russia is a friend and an ally. So this is something to watch for. The second issue is, and as the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, we did release a report on Erdogan's hostage diplomacy. And the second issue to watch for is what will happen to the Western nationals in Turkish prisons. Now, there are often negative news coming from Turkey, so one glimmer of hope is quite a number of the Western nationals have been released within the last year, particularly some of the German journalists. And Pastor Brunson will have a third hearing on July 18th. So there are some hopes that Erdogan, in an attempt to improve relations with the US, might release Pastor Brunson. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, how can a president release, really issue a pardon? No, but this is how the Turkish courts work right now. Erdogan is fully in charge. It only takes him a phone call to get someone arrested or released. So the optimists on this side of the Atlantic hope that on July 18th, Erdogan might take a positive step. The third issue to watch for is, of course, Syria, because the US forces and US-backed SDF forces have been on a crash course with Turkish forces in northern Syria. Turkey sees Syrian Kurdish domination of the northern part as an existential threat. And this is not just about Erdogan. I would argue the 70 to 80% of the Turkish public perceive Syria in a similar fashion. To them, it's not about Iranian influence, it's not about Assad at this point, it's about Syrian Kurds gaining autonomy, gaining self-rule. And those of you who have been following Turkish politics over the decades, this is a key, I would argue, a fixation in Turkish politics, which has ramifications both for Turkey's domestic politics as well as for foreign policy. There is an ongoing US-Turkish roadmap concerning how to deconflict, Manbij and other Syrian Kurdish controlled areas and SDF controlled areas. And we will see how this goes on during the implementation period. So implementation is always trickier than a roadmap, which is mostly in principles. And finally, what I call the real elephant in the room, which is not yet visible, but which is there, is of course Iran. Because as US introduces a new wave of sanctions against Iran, and as, within the last couple of months, we are seeing that, India and various EU countries are slowly pulling out. They're getting ready for the new wave of sanctions. But there's one country that's not doing it, and that is Erdogan's Turkey. Erdogan and his aides have repeatedly reiterated their commitment to help Iran evade sanctions again. And this will, again, put Turkey and US on a crash course. As a reminder, earlier this year, the Deputy General Manager of Turkey's second largest public lender, Halkbank, was convicted in Manhattan for help Iran evade sanctions. So this was, Turkey, Erdogan's Turkey played a major role at the height of the US sanctions against Iran, 2012, 2013, and basically saved the regime. When the regime was about to collapse because they didn't have any access to, US dollars, Turkey provided tens of billions of dollars and gold and helped Iran circumvent sanctions. Which brings us to another crash course, and that is the ongoing negotiations at the US Treasury concerning the fine against Halkbank for sanctions evasion. Those of us who follow the case closely knows that we're talking about double-digit billions of dollars, and if the Treasury has a strict interpretation of the sanction evasion, and if the Treasury issues a hefty fine, first of all, this will trigger a harsh Turkish response. Second, this could trigger or further push Turkish economy over the edge, and it will have, again, both economic and diplomatic repercussions. So let me end with, I think, a key question which we all have in mind, I think, in Washington. Ultimately, will pragmatism overcome? Meaning, now that Erdogan has a burning economic crisis at home, an imminent economic crisis at home, will he continue with a kind of a belligerent, adventurous, kind of anti-Western policy, or will he try to calm things down by acting in a more pragmatic manner in bilateral and multilateral relations with the US, EU, and NATO? And we can maybe go into more soothsaying and predictions during the Q&A. Thank you.
And thank you to the Endowment for Middle East Truth for providing me with the opportunity to address you today in my capacity as co-chair of the Hellenic Caucus and also the Congressional Hellenic Israel Alliance, the International Religious Freedom Caucus. I co-chair that as well, and as you can tell, I'm very interested in these issues, and an executive committee director of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Foundation, the Commission, for discussion on the US-Turkish relations post-referendum. It would appear that outrageous behavior is the new norm for Erdogan's government, unfortunately, in Turkey. Here are just a few examples, and most of you know this, but I'm going to remind you. April 2017, Erdogan narrowly won referendum, vastly expanding his powers as president. May 2017, Erdogan's security forces brutally attacked peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. I know you recall that. December 2017, Erdogan said, and I quote, "The ones who made Jerusalem a dungeon for Muslims and members of other religions will never be able to clean the blood from their hands." With their decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the United States has become a partner in this bloodshed, according to Erdogan, unquote. December 2017, Turkey signs agreement to buy 4 of Russia's S-400 surface-to-air missile batteries, which are not interoperable with NATO assets. January 2018, in its Freedom in the World 2018 report, Freedom House ranks Turkey as not free and explains that the ruling party has shown, and I quote, "and the ruling party has shown growing contempt for political rights and civil liberties in recent years." Turkey is now listed in the same category as Afghanistan, Myanmar, Congo, and Yemen. February 2018, Erdogan threatened U.S. forces fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria, saying, "It is obvious that those who say they will give a sharp response if they were hit have not been hit by the Ottoman slap." For those who are unaware of what he's referring to, the Ottoman slap, and most people know, was allegedly a fatal martial arts technique used by the Ottoman forces during the 17th century when a soldier lost his weapon in battle. Supposedly, it was devastating enough to cause a concussion or even break the enemy's neck. Allies, ladies and gentlemen, do not threaten U.S. troops, and allies do not attack U.S. citizens on American soil. It's as simple as that. Allies do not disrespect, threaten, and commit brazen acts of violence against each other. They support one another. However, this is not what we've seen from Erdogan's government. Look no further than the current relationship with its historic Mediterranean neighbor and fellow NATO ally, Greece. I know personally about these situations because it goes back. My grandparents were born in Greece, and I still have strong connections to Greece and Cyprus. Last year, in just a single day, Turkey violated Greek airspace 141 times. This was only hours after Erdogan met with Greece's Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras. Earlier this year, Erdogan's forces intentionally rammed an unarmed Greek Coast Guard vessel near Greece's EMET islets, over which Greece and Turkey nearly went to war in 1996. Erdogan's Turkey refuses to recognize the sovereignty of Cyprus, to explore and develop its own energy in its exclusive economic zone. Now Erdogan's regime has announced a done deal with Russia to purchase S-400 missile defense system, announcing it would hit back if the U.S. upheld the law and brought sanctions against them. Does that sound like an ally? These flagrant and escalating violations of international law do nothing to advance regional interests and provide for stability and prosperity. As we have done times before, we must continue to condemn these acts of aggression and renew our call for Erdogan to demonstrate to the international community that Turkey is a reliable and responsible partner committed and accountable to all international laws and agreements. Someday Turkey may be a reliable ally again. However, in the meantime, Erdogan's recklessness cannot continue to go unanswered. Again, nothing against the Turkish people, but this is the type of leadership that we've seen from their leader, their prime minister, now president, in the last few years. We must stand up for ourselves and our allies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, and God bless you.
Start by talking a little bit about the transformation of Erdogan and the AKP over the past 16, 17 years, as I think that has a significant implication on both domestic politics, but also Turkey's relationship with the West in general, with the US in specific, because in the last few years we've seen a huge transition by Erdogan from a more progressive looking, and I know actually it's more difficult to talk about this now because it's been such a long time since we could actually call Erdogan someone who was taking risks in Turkey, who was trying to push through certain reforms which at the time were progressive measures until about 2010, where a lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum were actually applauding Erdogan for taking risks. But I think we're at a time now where this is, we talk about this as a distant memory now, and that specifically in the last couple of years, with his newfound friendship and alliance with the ultra far right Devlet Bahçeli, the leader of the MHP, which is the nationalist movement party in Turkey, we see this whole shift now of Erdogan turning into, well, arguably turning into, or whether he was like this all the time, into this nationalist figure who's spearheading Turkish nationalism right now inside Turkey, with Devlet Bahçeli, the previously outspoken nationalist, under his wings, less vocal, as like he's never been, and allowing Erdogan to front the nationalist rhetoric and the nationalist presence and the nationalist direction now Turkey is taking both internally and externally. Because we, especially in the last 2 years, we come off the back of a so-called, or actually a peace process that was, that had the Turkish government on one side and the armed Kurdish PKK. And this was seen to be a very courageous step that Erdogan took part in. But although I don't want to sit here and oversimplify everything and talk about how electoral mathematics determined the outcome both of that process, but also the direction of Erdogan took subsequently, but I would argue that that had a very significant impact on Erdogan's decisions, as they do in general. The peace process lasted for just over 2 years, open discussions. Erdogan actually took ownership of the process and opened discussions between his government and his representatives with both the leader of the PKK, who's in prison in Turkey, but also with PKK commanders in Oslo, in Norway. And this process culminated in agreements being drawn up, although not signed, quite significantly, but discussions that were being talked about on the media, tapes that were being leaked in which PKK commanders and representatives of Erdogan, especially Hakan Fidan, who's now the head of the secret services in the US, in Turkey, sorry. And when these were released, there was ownership of the whole process. But we saw that during this process, our party, the HDP, which is a pro-Kurdish party, but is now a much broader coalition of more the progressives in Turkey, anti-system movements, women's movements, LGBTQ activists and movements who are all now who now find themselves represented in the HDP. We saw that a party like the HDP, who until the 2015 elections, the 7 June 2015 elections, hadn't polled in more than 7% of the general vote, as a result of the peace process and as a result of, if you like, a decriminalization of pro-Kurdish politics in Turkey as a result of the whole process, the HDP, our party, polled in over 13% of the general vote. This means doubling its own vote. And at the same time, Erdogan and the AKP lost 9% and they fell down to 41% in the 7 June elections and lost their majority in the Turkish parliament. And after the 7 June elections, a government couldn't be formed. The AKP had lost its majority and Erdogan went crazy. The peace process actually was shelved and terminated 2 months before that election actually took place. And we saw that as such a significant issue in Turkey, arguably the most serious issue or obstacle in the democratization of Turkey, was shelved thanks to Erdogan's calculations of maintaining his hegemony in Turkey. This is an issue in which over 50,000 people have lost their lives over 3 decades. And this was sacrificed for Erdogan's own hegemonic ambitions. Now, after this process was dumped, we saw a significant transformation in Erdogan's appeal to the more progressive part of Turkey, to the more nationalist segments in Turkey that Aykan also talked about, where the fixation on the Kurdish issue was utilized again by Erdogan. The anti-Kurdish rhetoric, the more security-based, military-based operations against the PKK, again the rallying up of that nationalist rhetoric across the whole country, and which culminated in the actual alliance and his deepening of his friendship with Devlet Bahçeli and the MHP, culminated in the coalition that we saw in the most previous 24 June elections. Now we saw that Erdogan has completely lost any hope of being the figure for progress in Turkey again. He's now, he doesn't have a significant issue with being a legitimate leader of this country outside of Turkey. He puts out a demeanor in which what the congressman was saying earlier as well. I mean, he just doesn't care anymore. And this is the image that he's portraying to the whole world. And what this means when it comes to his relationship with the US is, in all honesty, my personal opinion is that he knows how to play this country. And he's done this actually very successfully over the last few years. Because even in half of the things that both Aykan and the congressman mentioned, if this had happened during any other time, especially any other time in the last 6 or 7 decades, there'd be much more significant consequences. But we see right now that even today in the NATO summit, we saw Erdogan and Trump walking side by side as if they were high school friends. We see the State Department always reluctant to say anything of significance or warnings to the direction Turkey is taking. I mean, I'm not one to sit here in DC and work on a destabilization of a relationship between the US and Turkey. I don't think that benefits anyone, especially my people. But I do think that the US, in terms of upholding its values, that it so openly supports around the world, has failed to do so in its relationship with Turkey, and specifically with Erdogan. And this has emboldened Erdogan in a lot of ways to actually implement his course of action, to take Turkey into a direction in which the US, arguably now, but if not now, definitely sometime in the very near future, will have to debate whether Turkey is objectively an ally, and whether the role that Turkey plays in the region right now is detrimental to US interests, both here in the country, but also throughout the whole Middle East. Because right now we're talking about a Turkey, politics to aside, we're talking about a Turkey that its social fabric is being played with. Its whole DNA is being played with. And maybe more so than any other country, especially in the Middle East, we're seeing a Turkey that is completely transforming its social fabric. Approval rates of the West and the US, as Aykan also said, down to about 5%. And so right now we can talk about the politics of what this means. We can talk about Erdogan and his future and the AKP. We can talk about who's ruling Turkey right now. But what kind of implications will this social transformation have for years down the line will be another thing I think that we'll be sitting here debating sometime in the future too. So I think that when this comes down to what kind of a course of action are we looking for here in DC? What kind of things can we expect for the US in its approach to Turkey? These things definitely have to be noted. That a Turkey that, civil war or a Kurdish-Turkish conflict, which right now, relatively speaking, is more calm within Turkey's borders, but which has now which has crossed the border into northern Syria and northern Iraq right now, where the Turkish military is conducting operations against the PKK. If we see a Turkey in which Erdogan has consolidated every single iota of power, if that continues and then the economy is crumbling on the one side and then having this huge military conflict, which will also have an impact on the direction Turkey is taking and the structures of Turkey, then this is a big risk for the stability of the region as a whole. And I think it's in the interest of everyone with any sort of interest in the region to ensure that Turkey does not go down that road. And as a country like the US, who has certain leverages with Turkey, it's probably the responsible thing to do to encourage institutions here, specifically the government and Congress, to make sure that Turkey isn't appeased, that Erdogan isn't appeased in whatever action he's taking, that the worry, the concern that Turkey will turn to Russia is a real concern, but that concern should not dictate US policy to Erdogan's personal agenda, in all honesty.
EMET has worked tirelessly on the Hill regarding the Turkish issue and the US-Turkish relations since the failed coup, I would say, and also regarding the recent Turkish incursion into northern Syria, in Afrin, northwest Syria, and also with the F-35 sales. We created, my colleague Adam Turner and I, we created the F-35 fact sheet for you guys, and it explains in detail what many of us have, what many of these panels have discussed today. Now, to discuss the broader implications within the Middle East and regarding Turkey, we often look at the Middle East as these failed states, Iran, how we want regime change from within, especially with this administration. We see that Iraq has been largely a failed state and has been under Iranian influence, and with the Shiite militias, has been largely under their influence, which can no longer govern itself. We know Syria is currently still in the same civil war since 2011, and both Syria and Iran face the fight against ISIS within the rise of ISIS since 2014. But now we have to look at Turkey as well, largely because Turkey is behaving the same exact way as Iran is behaving, I would argue, and that Iran is aiming to expand its influence in the Middle East, is taking advantage of failed states, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Turkey under Erdogan is attempting to revive the old Ottoman Empire. It's attempting to expand, and what happened in northern Syria, in Afrin, in a dominant Kurdish region enclave. And to keep in mind, it was the same Kurds that was protecting Afrin, the YPG, People's Protection Unit, under the Syrian Democratic Forces that fought ISIS alongside the United States and the coalition, who also liberated Raqqa in Syria as well, ISIS capital. But it's time to look at Turkey through the lens of NATO and ask ourselves, is Turkey a reliable ally? And that answer is, we can safely say that answer is no. Turkey is not, it may be on paper that Turkey is a NATO partner, but it's certainly not behaving as a NATO partner, and it's certainly not behaving as a US ally either. And a few years before the coup, but this really occurred since the failed coup of 2016. Turkey has pivoted more towards the east and more towards under Russian sphere of influence than the United States. And this has probably started when, earlier before that, I believe it was 2015, when Turkey shot down a Russian jet that flew over its airspace for about 12 seconds. Despite that, Turkey every day, as the congressman mentioned, on a daily basis about 141 times violates Greek airspace and water territory violations as well. But what Vladimir Putin did of Russia, he didn't overreact with Erdogan, because Vladimir Putin's ultimate goal is to create a rift between NATO partners and also a rift between Turkey and the United States. And unfortunately, Erdogan took that bait. And now we find ourselves, Erdogan purchasing Russian S-400 missiles that's incompatible with NATO NATO defense systems. And also, Erdogan has recently stated that he wants to jointly produce the S-500 missiles as well, which is the next level up of the S-400. And this is supposedly our NATO ally. And unfortunately, Turkey, this is all actions and behaviors of an adversary and not a partner, not a close partner. And also, unfortunately, that there's no mechanism within NATO to remove a state that is behaving as Turkey is. But the United States, yes, we are part of NATO, but the United States, at the end of the day, we do have to look out for our interests, our partners, and our allies in the Middle East as well. And in the interest of the United States, and in the interest, since there's no mechanism within NATO, we have to ask ourselves, can we, if tomorrow there was a war between Russia and NATO, can we rely on Turkey to protect Southeast Europe? And I would say that the answer is no. Turkey would not lift its finger. Erdogan would not attack Russia again and go against Putin. And this is very scary, because that means Article 5 would not be implemented under Erdogan. And that's largely because we've lost Turkey to Russia's sphere of influence. And recent elections, as our panelists mentioned, Erdogan was able to do this with a limited capacity up until a few weeks ago, since 2002. But now he has full executive powers until 2023, 5 more years. What makes us think that Erdogan he hasn't changed? What makes us think that he will change in 5 years? Erdogan hasn't given us any hints for us to believe him that he will change and come back into the Western influence and Western ideals of that, what we think of as democracy. In Syria, Erdogan acted in northwest Syria in Afrin. Just a little bit of background of Afrin is the indigenous populations are Kurds. About 800,000 Kurds live in Afrin. And Afrin, northwest Syria, is west of the Euphrates River. Majority of the Kurds and the Syrian Democratic Forces and the U.S. coalition are east of the Euphrates Valley and then east of the Euphrates River. Now, Afrin was a safe haven for not only Kurds, it was actually the only enclave in Syria that was untouched by the Assad regime from the Syrian civil war, and also by ISIS as well. That is why the Kurds in Afrin took in 450,000 refugees and IDPs from Syria and also from Iraq as well, including the Yazidi Kurdish minority that fled from Shingal Mountain. So they sought refuge in Afrin because it was safe. Up until, I believe it was January 20th, up until Erdogan declared Operation Olive Branch, which basically it was a declaration of war against the Kurds. Why would you? And it also opened a whole new front of war after 7 long years. So this is clearly to prolong the war. This is clearly to prolong the Syrian civil war and also to dismantle what the Kurds have created in northwest Syria and also east of the Euphrates, which is elections, equal rights for men and women, participation of government for minorities and religious minorities, and also it's the indigenous population. So Erdogan saying that these are terrorists in the south. Erdogan labeling the Kurds as terrorists in the south is uncalled for. These are indigenous populations and they happen to be Kurds. And Erdogan is largely doing this against the Kurds in northern Syria is because he fears his own Kurds, about 20% of the Turkish population. He fears that they will rise and they will also ask for self-rule and autonomy as the Kurds recently in Iraqi Kurdistan have with the referendum. And in Iraq, Giran mentioned this, that he has over 20 military bases in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I would argue this is also in collaboration with some Kurdish factions in the Iraqi Kurdistan, unfortunately, but this is also part of the same plan of his expansionist ideas to revive this Ottoman mentality, this Ottoman Empire, and to basically, we have to look at Iran moving south, and Turkey is more expanding north. So this is very dangerous. And Erdogan, when the Kurds declared the referendum, when they called for the referendum September 25th of last year, of 2017, Erdogan threatened that he would declare a war. He basically had military drills along the Iraqi Kurdistan border, and that he threatened the Kurds in Iraq that we would come at you at night, we would invade you at night while you're sleeping. And with this, he continues to date. He continues to bomb Kurds in the Kurdistan region with his 20 military bases and his strong presence in the region. And Dr. Erdemir mentioned evading Iranian sanctions, and also our other U.S. ally, which is Israel. Erdogan is very anti-Israel, despite his economic partnership with the state of Israel. He's been very outspoken against the embassy move in Jerusalem. He has threatened to call for an army of Islam to basically unite the Muslim majority countries to invade Israel because of the embassy move by this administration. And also, Erdogan labels Kurds as terrorists within Turkey. He labels Kurds within Syria as terrorists, despite them being U.S. allies and partners, and they've been the ones who fought and liberated towns and villages from ISIS and Assad regime. He openly collaborates, and he doesn't hide this, with Hamas. Hamas is a U.S. designated terrorist organization. He openly invites them and has speeches with them to Turkey. I believe they have an office there, I believe, inside Turkey as well. So we have to ask ourselves, are these the actions of an ally that we know? Would this be accepted if Turkey was not a NATO partner? And I think it's this issue that Turkey is our NATO partner that's holding us on, that we're not able to maneuver. So, and of course there's the additional misbehaviors of Erdogan with the hostage taking of Pastor Brunson, and also attacking Americans on U.S. soil here in Sheridan Circle. So the solution is, as I said previously, we have to prevent Erdogan from receiving these F-35 missiles. This will send a strong signal to Erdogan, because if Erdogan receives these U.S. jet fighters, the F-35s, they will most likely end up in Russia's hands. These are U.S. technology that will end up in Russian hands, that Russia can easily collect data and information from. And especially with purchasing the S-400 missiles, this is very incompatible with even U.S. interests too. So the United States we continue to look at Turkey as it was in the 90s, where it was a very strong and reliable NATO partner. Turkey was interested in becoming a European Union member. But the United States is still, unfortunately, looking through the lens that Turkey is still the same image that we have of what Turkey is. Turkey is no longer that reliable partner under Erdogan. He slowly shifted from winning the elections in 2002 to this recent election in 2018 towards more of a Islamo-fascist government that is anti-opposition, anti-democratic, anti-Kurdish, and he wants to revive this old Ottoman map that he so believes in, and that's why they call him the Sultan. That's one of the nicknames that he has. So the United States has to adjust our policy specifically towards Turkey. We do have to stop appeasing Turkey, because if we don't, Turkey and Erdogan will continue to behave in this action. Thank you. The recent Turkish elections prove that Erdogan is won only 52%. Yes, that's the majority, but there's also a very strong opposition to Erdogan inside the country. So this nationalist movement, yes, it's very strong. It is the majority, unfortunately, but I wouldn't say it's Turks as whole. It's definitely not Turks as whole to revive this old Ottoman ideals and this, especially physically, on the map. But it is a dangerous one that we can see it, becoming a reality, and that's he took advice from Vladimir Putin. I mean, Vladimir Putin took territory under the previous administration, and we see Turkey doing the same thing with Syria. And in Afrin, it's unlikely that he will reverse these actions. He will hold on to Afrin, because we've seen that. If we like to look at Turkish history, we've seen that since 1974, Turkey has occupied Northern Cyprus and has failed to return these lands to Cyprus. And the Ottoman expansionist ideas also, we can see this happening with the incursions and the violations in the Aegean Sea against the Greeks as well.
There is a very effective state-funded and crony-funded media campaign to inculcate pan-Islamist, neo-Ottoman, anti-Western, anti-Christian, and anti-Semitic values. And the most effective media happens to be historical dramas. As Turkish audiences, tens of millions are basically glued to the screen to watch revisionist histories funded by Erdogan. Nevertheless, as Diliman, I think, very elaborately put it together, Turkey is a very divided, polarized country. Although there is a strong, let's say, there's a strong appeal of neo-Ottomanism for maybe 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, there is an equally strong appeal of secular kind of pro-Western Republican Turkey as well, and that Kulturkampf, that polarization will remain there. And the second issue to consider is, neo-Ottomanism is, of course, not only about Turkey, it's also about the former Ottoman territories. So there's the important question of, what do people really think in the Balkans, in the Middle East, in North Africa, in the Caucasus? Are former, quote-unquote, subject peoples looking forward to yet another era of, Ottoman, Sultan rule, ruled by Erdogan? And I think this is where the mismatch is. Erdogan's perception of the desirability of a neo-Ottoman kind of sphere of influence, direct, indirect, does not seem to be matched on the other side. Sure, there are small pockets of clients of Erdogan who are, let's say, on Erdogan's payroll, or who benefit from this policy. But of course, for the most part, whether we're talking about the Arab majority countries to the south, whether we're talking about the Balkan countries to the northwest, I think they would like to see cordial relations with Turkey, but they would not want a big brother. They've had their fair share of big brothers, from the Ottomans to other overlords. So I think this mismatch will continue to undermine Erdogan's neo-Ottomanism. That is, it sells well at home to half of the Turkish public, but it's neither attractive for the other half nor for the former subject peoples. Now, there are at least 3 reasons why Turkey is an important partner and, from Washington's perspective, needs to remain so, which means in Washington there will always be a strong impetus to look the other way. One is what I call the real estate value. It's not just the Incirlik air base, but it's Turkey bordering Russia, Iran, Iraq, Syria.
And its location.
Yes, you don't want to, as NATO, you don't want to lose this real estate. Second, anyone who thinks about the future of the Middle East thinks about Iran and how to counterbalance Iran. And in that respect, Turkey, drifting completely away from the West looks like a disaster scenario.
It's a bad idea. You want to avoid it.
Third one, Turkey is too big to fail. As we have seen with also the US economic crisis, when it's too big to fail, we're willing to swallow, let's say, painful pills for 2 reasons. One, a semi-failed Turkey is disaster for Europe. Compare the scale of failed Syria versus failed Turkey, what that would imply. Furthermore, Turkey is the gatekeeper to the Syrian refugees, and Erdogan is willing to blackmail the EU. He's willing to bust the refugees to the European Union border. So there are all these, plus European banks' exposure to the Turkish markets. It's tens of billions of dollars. So for all these reasons, I know these are not principled reasons. This is not about human rights. This is not about democracy. This is not about transatlantic values. But yeah, there are these pragmatic reasons which make Turkey, let's say, which allows Erdogan to act as a rogue ally. Now, the challenge there is this. So I get this pragmatic line of reasoning, which I argue tends to dominate a lot of the thinking in Washington. The problem tends to start when these reasons, which are provided as looking the other way, turn out to be not accurate. Meaning, for example, we need Turkey as a counterbalance to Iran, but Turkey was the member of the UN Security Committee that voted against Iran sanctions. Turkey was the country that saved Iran at the height of 2012, 2013. Turkey, now Erdogan's Turkey, is the only country that says we will defy the new wave of sanctions. So, interestingly, Turkey that NATO needs to counterbalance Iran is also Iran's greatest enabler. Turkey that NATO needs to counterbalance Russia is now Russia's enabler in Syria through the S-400 deal, through potential leak of F-35 flight data to Russian engineers and technicians that come with S-400. So it is becoming a very complicated and gray matter too. So I completely get your side of the story as a committed transatlanticist, Euro-federalist, who have spoken for Turkey's strong and continued commitment to the transatlantic alliance at all costs. Trust me, it's the worst political position ever that one can take in Turkey, which I took, continue to take as a committed transatlanticist who get the pragmatic side, who would like to sustain this relationship. I also know that Erdogan is defying NATO and its interests and the transatlantic values on every single point, including enabling Iran, including undermining even the Western economic system. So this is a leader, an autocrat in the making, who has been raised from his childhood with deep ingrained anti-Western, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic ideas. This is not your average populist politician. This is a leader who at age 17 who wrote, directed, staged and acted a play which claimed everything we see in the world, all the evil, is because of a Mason communist Jewish conspiracy. So he has been inculcated, unfortunately for Turkey and the world, he has been inculcated with hatred, prejudice. And yes, there were times when he was pragmatic. Kurdish peace process, when I supported his move, again at great risk to my own political career, because it was the right thing to do. He did it the wrong way, but it was the right move. But then he immediately kind of lapses back into his core values. And those core values, unfortunately, are very dark, and it makes even a pragmatic transactional relationship increasingly challenging. And I'm afraid, despite the strong impetus for transactionalism and pragmatism, Erdogan will manage to turn this relationship into an actual crash course.
Like a quick contribution to that, just in the sense that I think we need to be careful in making the distinction between Turkey and Erdogan as well. I think location for me would be the most significant aspect of why Turkey will always be an ally to the US. And I seriously would say good luck to anyone advocating to the contrary here in DC. But I think one thing that we'll always be careful to do is that yes, Turkey will always be an ally, but the question is whether Erdogan, at the helm of that country right now, is an ally or not. And I think that distinction is something that we'd be very careful.
John mentioned the location and the geography of where Turkey is located. I'll play, the director of the Kurdistan Project, I'll pull out the Kurdish card. The United States has to create an independent Kurdish policy. Now, it may be a Kurdish state, maybe a autonomous region for the Kurds, but the United States does have other options in the Middle East aside from Turkey. And it is a difficult task, but the Kurds are pro-Western. The Kurds are pro-American. During the 2003 Iraqi war, not one American life was lost in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish region. In Syria, it was the Syrian Kurds that defended the refugees and the minorities. It was the Syrian Kurds that liberated Raqqa, ISIS capital. And it's the Syrian Kurds today that are working with US forces. US generals and military officials are walking around without weapons in northern Syria. It's the same Iranian Kurds that we will eventually have to rely on when regime change does occur, and if it does occur from within, because there are 12 million Kurds inside Iran, and there's up to 20 million Kurds inside Turkey as well. So the United States does have alternative options in the Middle East.
I summarize it as a systematic Russian strategy to build hybrid warfare capacity in Turkey. And what I mean by that is Russia reaches out to Turkey in multiple ways. One is, the first step was energy dependence. Turkey became 55 to 60% dependent on Russian gas. Then Russia also supplied oil. And now Russia is building Turkey's first nuclear reactor. So Turkey is hedging Russian gas with Russian nuclear. A horrible idea. Even a worse idea is that nuclear plant is on the Mediterranean coast, in Akbil. So Russia and Russian engineers and technicians and advisors and a Russian company, Rosatom, will now have basically a Mediterranean coast presence. I know there is already Tartus in Syria, but that's not enough. I think increased Russian presence and what I call hybrid warfare capacity in Turkey, that is being able to have leverage over Turkish decision making through oil, gas, nuclear, economic cooperation, S-400 military cooperation. I think that is a dangerous trend. And it is a smart, we have to, I think, acknowledge Putin's smart chess play here. Historically, one could compare it to what happened with US in Egypt. How Egypt became from, let's say, a Russian satellite country to, let's say, a somewhat ally of the US and the West. If Putin is as the US ambassador to NATO just said, able to flip Turkey, it will be a remarkable flip. And on the part of the EU and the US, it will be a remarkable failure. And on the part of Russia, it will be an immense foothold in the Mediterranean, as you said.
Definitely, I definitely agree with you, and that's what's happening with Erdogan's media network, and it's very anti-Semitic, very anti-Israel, and Erdogan sees himself as the custodian of Jerusalem, which is also creating risks with Arab neighbors, especially Jordan as well. As far as a solution, I think that's up to the opposition, the Turkish opposition. It's a 48% strong, up to 50% strong, that are able to defy this idea that Erdogan is pushing that. Because at the end of the day, the Arab states in the Middle East will not allow Erdogan to be the ruler or the big brother, as Dr. Erdemir mentioned. So it's in the interest of the Arab states to not only have better relations with Israel, especially as Turkey's relations with Israel is going downhill. Now, this is just the public face of it. Turkey does have very strong economic ties with Israel, and I think on the Israeli side, they're not willing to risk that as well. So they do acknowledge the anti-Semitic themes that are coming out of Erdogan's media network, but also they are continuing the economic ties. But they're also taking steps. Just recently, Israel signed I believe they signed the deal, but with Cyprus and Greece for the pipeline, for the gas pipeline deal, and that would basically go around Turkey's wishes.
So for Erdogan, proxy wars abroad was his way of flexing Islamist foreign policy muscles. This was his, let's say, proactive foreign policy vision. He believed Turkey, first and foremost through the Muslim Brotherhood network, and second through other Islamist proxies, could extend its sphere of influence, appeal to the streets, especially the Muslim street or the Arab street, and this would, he believed, this would boost his image at home as a strong global leader, and also he believed this would extend the Turkish sphere of influence. Now let's do the tally. I think things haven't gone as planned. What we're seeing is, yes, Erdogan does have some appeal, especially among the Muslim Brotherhood circles globally. Turkey has been increasingly shut off from the Muslim world as well as the Arab world. We're seeing a lot of Turkish investments going south in these, as bilateral relations sour, as state-to-state relations sour. We're seeing first Turkey losing its soft power. Second, Turkish businesses losing market share. Third, Turkey being diplomatically isolated and increasingly limited to working through, Iran, Qatar, Hamas, a really very narrow circle that ends up imprisoning Turkey. So, how to go beyond that? I think now that the economy is really beginning to hurt the average Turkish citizen, just like as we see in Iran, where the average Iranian citizen is now saying, why are we fighting all these costly wars that have nothing to do with us? We want bread at home. I think we will begin to hear increasing calls for Turkish foreign policy to revert from what I would call an adventurous neo-Ottoman pan-Islamist foreign policy to a trade diplomacy, which actually worked pretty well in the early years of the AKP. When trade diplomacy was the main kind of vision for Turkey, Turkey increased exports, market share, soft power, develop bilateral and multilateral relations, and it basically put bread on people's tables. So I'm hoping that for the wrong reason, that is the economic crisis, we might get to see the way out of this and curb down Islamist adventurism abroad.
So Erdogan is definitely, when he's speaking, he speaks to those people. He speaks to those nationalist, very hardcore Muslim population. And for example, like Pakistan or his proxies across the Middle East and even in Europe as well, he's taking advantage. And even I would argue inside Jerusalem too, where he's paying organizations on the ground to basically be the spokesperson for Muslims, and that's defying the Palestinian Authority on the ground. So he's definitely popular among those populations, but also, again, the majority of the Muslim population and Muslim countries, which are the Arab states, don't approve of this message because they fear that Erdogan is trying to expand, going back to that Ottoman expansionist idea, that they don't want to be ruled by a sultan such as Erdogan. And he will have some friction with the Iranians too, because the Iranians are, the regime has its own agenda of expanding, and that will create a rift between the two. Among Kurds, there's a joke, the only thing that will bring Iranians and Turks, the Turkish governments together is the Kurdish issue. And we saw that during the referendum and many times over the PKK as well.
I think what we're seeing is a compartmentalization within the administration. Certainly there are high-rank officials in this administration who are, who have an in-depth grasp of the issue at hand, all the way from, Russia to Islamism, to illicit finance, to kind of Iran sanctions busting. So, at least at the level of grasp of the issue, the expertise is there. But then we see different modalities of interacting with Turkey. For example, when it comes to the president, the two presidents, we see the relationship is very interpersonal. And we see on both sides there is a pretty firm belief that as kind of two business people, person-to-person relations can overcome challenges. We have a State Department that's trying to just sustain the relationship. Of course, they're keeping an eye on 3 Foreign Service nationals, the 3 employees of the US State Department who happen to be, 2 in jail and 1 in house arrest. And so they have little room for maneuver. And at the same time, then there is, Mike Pompeo, who is not only very concerned about the Iran issue, but is also a champion of religious freedoms, who cares deeply about Pastor Brunson, who belongs to the same church as Pastor Brunson, who cannot really look the other way on these issues. So what we will see is, you might call it good cop, bad cop. Others might call it compartmentalization. We will continue to see US-Turkish relations moving in multiple gears simultaneously. So we will continue to see, I think, in Washington, conflicting messages, conflicting signals coming from the Congress, White House, State Department, Pentagon, and don't feel bad about it. It's the exact thing coming from the EU. So the EU, on the one hand, because of the refugee issue, has to tango with Erdogan. On the other hand, right before this panel started, for example, German government just cracked down on a pro-Erdogan gang in Germany, involved in trafficking, sex slavery, narco, trade, illicit finance, thuggery, intimidation of Kurds and other dissidents. So, which one is, you might ask, which one is the real German? They're both real. So on the one hand, they have to work with Erdogan, very pragmatic, transactional On the other hand, they don't like what they see. They also have a tough act. Same, I think, goes for the US. You know, I did also as a parliamentarian, did a lot of work in the Balkans and strongly committed to what's called kind of Western Balkan incorporation, not only into the EU but into the NATO structure as well. And I think it's really crucial for the safety and stability of the European continent itself, not just for the Balkans. And our own observation was what appeared to Erdogan as a smart move, that is reaching out to ethnic Turks or Muslims in the Balkans, turned out to be a horrible strategy, both for Turkey and for the Balkans themselves, for two reasons. On the Turkish side, it increasingly limited Turkish interaction with narrow ethnic/religious brethren. Whereas we know that the Balkan geography is a multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multilingual geography, and if you have such a narrow approach to the Balkans through just your own kind of affiliated groups, it will undermine your foreign policy, and it will destabilize those regions. It will hurt those minorities you're interacting with, and it will also further escalate inter and intra-communal tension. So that's one. The second issue is Erdogan's outreach was not just to clients, not just to NGOs or communities. It is becoming increasingly a political involvement. For example, in Bulgaria, Erdogan looked at Bulgaria. There was a strong, influential a minority party that represented Turks and Muslims, a coalition partner, a very effective part of the Bulgarian government and society. And guess what happened? Erdogan said, I don't like these guys. They're too liberal for my taste in terms of being too secular, too pro-West, too, let's say, well integrated into Bulgaria. He funded and encouraged setting up a separate party that would be closer to Erdogan's vision. Thanks God, Bulgarian Turks and Muslims are smart. They didn't vote for Erdogan's well-funded party. They stick to their original party. Now the question there is, what will this do to, let's say, Bulgaria? What will this do to other Western Balkan countries when you have Erdogan very effectively trying to refashion, reshape these local communities? And the Balkan Muslims and the Balkan Turks are some of the best kind of integrated, secular, kind of believing in gender equality, believing in European Union integration, groups that you can find in the region. But we have Erdogan effectively, he's like an elephant in a China store. Not only through this proxy action, but also I remember very vividly when he said, that there are all these, long, difficult talks between, Serbia, Kosovo, trying to, stabilize things. And Erdogan comes into the scene and says, Kosovo is Turkey. You can imagine what that does. It's such a lose-lose policy. It will inflame not only Serbian nationalism and extremism, but also Albanian nationalism and extremism. So it will undermine these kind of long, painful talks. So my conclusion is, Turkey needs to re-engage the Balkans, not just proxy groups, but the entirety of the Balkans, and not as an adventurous Islamist power, but as a NATO member and as an EU accession country, so that the Balkan peoples could also become a functional member of these various European and transatlantic institutions, so that Russian hybrid warfare capacity is undermined in the region. Because as long as there is economic, political, security risk in the Balkans, it will open up space for Russians to exploit. Turkey, which could play a major, I would say, a constructive role against such Russian let's say, meddling in the Balkans is unfortunately at this point an enabler.
Yeah, so with Iraqi Kurdistan, so as I mentioned before, the Turkish government under Erdogan was very against the Kurdish independence referendum September 25th of last year, despite strong economic relations. I believe the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, is the second biggest exporter to Turkey in terms of oil. And that's through, they've established a pipeline from Kirkuk, northern Iraq, up into to Ceyhan in southeast Turkey. So the economic relations, even through with the threats when the referendum occurred, the borders remained open. The economic relations were still continuing. Turkey did close down its flights to Erbil and Süleymaniye, two international airports, because of the referendum. But I would say internally within the Kurdistan regional government, Turkey has a much stronger relations with the Kurdistan Democratic Party that's led by Masoud Barzani, the former president, who also led the referendum, than the alternative family, the Talabani family, which was the late Iraqi president and leader of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. So there is a faction, and Turkey just recently blamed the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, and the opposition, the main opposition within the Kurdistan regional government, the Goran, the change movement, of supporting the PKK, which they responded by saying, we support Kurds, pushing for their rights within their territories. But definitely the KDP and AKP, Erdogan's party, has very strong relations, and that's why they have over 20 military bases. They're able to have over 20 military bases in northern Iraq.
To add to that, the KRG, for example, in northern Iraq, there's been a Kurdish entity, a de facto independence, actually, if you like, for almost 3 decades. But what we can see that the impact that that's had on Kurdish aspirations in Turkey has been actually very limited. One, I think that's because there's a linguistic difference between the dominant Kurdish language that's spoken in northern Iraq with that of the Kurdish that's spoken in Turkey. One's Sorani in northern Iraq, and the other is Kurmanji, predominantly within Turkey. And also the relationship between the Syrian Kurds and the Kurds of Turkey, not just culturally but politically, it's much closer as well. Now, the dominant political force in northern Syria is the PKK affiliated, is what I think the term is, right, that we use. The PKK affiliated political force that dominates the scene in northern Syria. We saw for example, when Kobani was sieged by ISIS, we saw thousands of young Kurds, and actually Turks as well, that fled over across the border, jumped the fences to defend the city against ISIS, of which hundreds lost their lives in that battle. Now, the border between Syria and Turkey, the border that splits the Kurds there, is actually so much less. It has no reflection on the makeup of that specific area. There are lots of Kurdish towns and villages that are completely divided. The fence actually runs through the middle of several villages and even towns. And so the tie is much closer there. Now I think obviously the Turkish state's age-old fixation, which was actually a nice word, is that if a Kurdish entity develops in northern Syria, it's going to have a much more significant impact on Kurdish aspirations within Turkey, and I think that determines the relationship quite significantly.